Hi, I'm Andy Caffrey. Welcome to the Clear the Coast of Nuclear Power Roadshow. This is a presentation designed for activists who are concerned about global warming, concerned about nuclear power, and I'm going to be specifically talking about what's happening with our polar ice sheet situation. I've been working on this issue since 1995, and in 2014 NASA announced that the collapse of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet is unstoppable. And I worked for 20 years to try to get the world to pay attention to this issue before it became unstoppable. Most of you probably don't know much about Antarctica, which is kind of the problem. I'll tell you a little bit about my early years. I was born in 1957. 1956, 1957 is when we had International Geophysical Year. And that was the first time that scientists around the world first started to study Antarctica. So most of the science we have about what has happened in Antarctica is really quite new. In fact, what the surface layer is like and what the underneath is like, that was only discovered in the 1990s. So I'm about to turn 60. Now, when I was born, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were 315 parts per million. And the lesson I want to convey to you is it matters how far it goes. There are consequences. If we just ignore it or just do little tidbits of actions to make changes, the question is, well, is that enough? If someone is doing meth, you don't just tell the person, well, just cut back one line of meth a month and you'll be fine, you're making progress. You need to get the person off meth. So the research I've done and what I'm going to present to you today is how do we determine what is too much? That shows you the entire continent of Antarctica and the light area extending out from the continent. That's called sea ice. And every winter that grows, you're seeing it in the winter, and then it retreats in the summer, so about pretty much doubles the size. Antarctica has three main places. You can see on the right is East Antarctica. That's about the size of China. And it is separated from West Antarctica by the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. That's the area to the left. And sticking out from that is the Antarctic Peninsula. And if you heard in the news a couple of weeks ago about an iceberg the size of Delaware breaking off of there, that was the Antarctic Peninsula that lost the Delaware-sized iceberg. And the part closest to the tip, Larsen A, broke off in 1995. And that's when I first got concerned. When these ice sheets started breaking up, is it global warming that's causing that? And I wrote this article in the Earth Island Journal warning that global warming was going to cause the breakup of the entire West Antarctic ice sheet. And then in 2002, I was shown to be right that the ice sheet is in fact deteriorating and the Larsen B broke off. And then just a couple of weeks ago, you can see the biggest chunk so far, and they've got a little image of the state of Delaware right off the coast there, so you can see how big it is. That broke off. Now, Antarctica's got 90% of all the world's ice. The only other area on Earth that's got a large amount of ice is Greenland. Greenland's got about 10% of the world's ice. So you've got East Antarctica, which has 80% of the world's ice. West Antarctica has about 10% of the world's ice. And Greenland has about 10% of the world's ice. Those are continental ice sheets. They're sitting on land. So if they melt, that meltwater is added to the ocean, and that causes sea level rise. The sea ice that surrounds Antarctica in the winter, and the sea ice that covers the Arctic, when that melts, it just goes back into the water because it's part of the water. So that doesn't affect sea level at all. So You may have heard a lot about what's happening with the Arctic. West Antarctica is a very different situation. The reason I'm here is because I want you to do something. I'd like you to take the knowledge I'm presenting here and become an activist. Because you see, what's happened is we've basically caused the West Antarctic sheet to collapse over the next few decades. And because of that, we're going to see 20 feet of sea level rise over the next, well, half century, which means that there's a threat to everything that's on the coast, including our nuclear power plants. And it takes 60 years to decommission a nuclear power plant. So the question is, can we decommission them before the sea level increases? So here you can see that over the last couple of decades, the West Antarctic Ice Sheet and the Antarctic Peninsula have warmed a lot. In fact, Antarctica and the Arctic are the two areas that have warmed the most over the last several decades because of global warming. This shows you the surface underneath the ice sheet. So you can see these light blue areas. Those are the areas that are below sea level. So it's not a very stable situation. West Antarctica, the ice is sitting on the bottom of the ocean. And that's why it's so vulnerable, because as the ocean warms from global warming, it's melting the ice underneath. The ice in East Antarctica is much more stable because it doesn't have this warming water underneath. This is a presentation that NASA has made about several of these situations.
No turning back. West Antarctic glaciers in irreversible decline. Presented by Science at NASA. Over the years, as temperatures around the world have ratcheted upward, climate change researchers have kept a wary eye on one place perhaps more than any other, the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, and particularly the fastest melting part of it, the glaciers that flow into the Amundsen Sea. In that region, 6 glaciers hang in precarious balance, partially supported by land and partially floating in waters just offshore. There's enough water frozen in the ice sheet that feeds these icy giants to raise global sea levels by 4 feet, if they were to melt. That's troubling because the glaciers are melting. Moreover, a new study finds that their decline appears to be irreversible. We've passed the point of no return, says Eric Renaud, a glaciologist working jointly at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the University of California, Irvine. Renaud and colleagues have used 19 years of satellite radar data to map the fast-melting glaciers. In their paper, which has been accepted for publication in Geophysical Research Letters, they conclude that this sector of West Antarctica is undergoing a marine ice sheet instability that will significantly contribute to sea level rise in the centuries ahead. A key concept in the Renaud study is the grounding line, the dividing line between land and water underneath the glacier. Because virtually all melting occurs where the glacier's undersides touch the ocean, pinpointing the grounding line is crucial for estimating melt rates. The problem is, grounding lines are buried under thousands of feet of glacial ice. It's challenging for a human observer to figure out where they are, Renaud explains. There's nothing obvious that sticks out on the surface to say, this is where the glacier goes afloat. To find the hidden grounding lines, they examined radar images of the glaciers made by the European Space Agency's Earth remote sensing satellites from 1992 to 2011. Glaciers flex in response to tides. By analyzing the flexing motions, they were able to trace the grounding lines. This led to a key discovery. In all the glaciers they studied, grounding lines were rapidly retreating away from the sea. In this sector, we are seeing retreat rates that we don't see anywhere else on Earth, Renaud says. Smith Glacier's line moved the fastest, retreating 22 miles upstream. The other lines retreated from 6 to 19 miles. As the glaciers melt and lose weight, they float off the land where they used to sit. Water gets underneath the glacier and pushes the grounding line inland. This, in turn, reduces friction between the glacier and its bed. The glacier speeds up, stretches out, and thins, which drives the grounding line to retreat farther inland. This is a positive feedback loop that leads to out-of-control melting. The only natural factor that can slow or stop this process is a pinning point in the bedrock, a bump or projection that snags the glacier from underneath and keeps it from sliding toward the sea. To investigate this possibility, the researchers made a novel map of the bed beneath the glaciers using radar and other data from satellites and NASA's Airborne Ice Bridge mission. The map revealed that the glaciers had already floated off many of their small pinning points. In short, there seems to be no turning back.
Now, the concern that scientists have now with Greenland is because we've got this incredible acceleration on melting. What we're doing now is melting the entire ice world, which is called the cryosphere, faster than ever before. In the entire 2016 presidential campaign, nobody was talking about this. Nobody. And the CO2 range during the Pleistocene is between 170 and 280 parts per million. That's the natural range. So all of the ecosystems never really had to deal with anything higher than the absolute highest was 297 parts per million. So for 2.5 million years, just between 170 and 280, about 250 years ago, just before the Industrial Revolution began, it was up to 280 parts per million. And when it gets to 280, that's when it seems to kick into a glacial period. So we were due to go into another glacial period. We'd been through 10,000 years of an interglacial. It was time to go into the next ice age. That's why people into the 1970s were talking about how there was global cooling, that we were going back into an ice age. And because it reversed around 1976, we started to see that it wasn't cooling anymore, it was warming. That's how we started to think about global warming actually kicking in, that it was actually a real-world phenomenon. It wasn't just a theory anymore. Al Gore and I happened to have the same teacher, a guy named Roger Revelle, and just coincidentally, the same year I was born, he started measuring atmospheric carbon dioxide at a laboratory in Hawaii, at Mauna Loa. And so that was, since it was around the time I was born, between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and 200 years later, when I was born in 1957, it had only gone up to 315. So it went from 280, which was already the top limit, up to 315. That's a 35 part per million increase over 200 years. Now, just during my lifetime, it's gone up 95 parts per million. So the first 200 years of the Industrial Revolution goes up 35 parts per million. In the last 60 years, it's gone up 95 parts per million. And we're now back up to where it was 3 to 5 million years ago in the Pliocene, when the ice sheets were melting and sea level was 80 feet higher. So we're in this danger zone. Before that first breakup of the Larsen A, all the world scientists were thinking, and you have to keep in mind, again, we only started researching Antarctica in the late 1950s, they were thinking it would take 1,000 to 3,000 years for the West Antarctic Ice Sheet to melt. And they thought about it in terms of a giant iceberg, or a giant ice cube, that just slowly melts. They didn't think of it like crushed ice. If you crush the ice, then you have much more surface area and it melts quicker. So in 1995, when I saw that, I started to do a lot of research in the stacks at the Berkeley Public Library. I read every issue of Science and Nature magazine, every article that they published about polar ice, and New Scientist magazine. And then I saw this article that was in Scientific American about a madhouse century. Now, as I mentioned, when you go in and out of these ice ages, sea level changes. So there were these scientists who were studying ancient coral records in the Bahamas. Now, coral is very interesting because it has to stay in that photic zone. So when you look at where prehistoric coral is on land, you can tell where the sea level was. So if it's 25 feet higher than coral is now, you can see that the sea level was 15 feet taller than that or whatever. So what they found was that 120,000 years ago, temperatures were about what they are now, sea level was about where it is now, and something happened. They didn't know what happened, but they could see in the prehistoric coral records that sea level suddenly went up 20 feet, and then it turned around and went down at least 50 feet, all in 100 years. And they called that the madhouse century. Now, because they're specialists in ancient sea level rise, they don't have experience in glaciology, they just published what they had discovered. They didn't speculate where that water came from. Where could water come from that would cause sea level to go up about, well, it's a net change, up 20 feet and down 50 feet. That's 70 feet of change in 100 years. So that means that sea level was going up about 8 inches per year. 8 inches per year. Can you imagine that? That's how much it's gone up over the last 100 years. So I started wondering, well, what could cause this? Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other scientists who have been talking about, is global warming going to pose a threat to West Antarctica? And their answer was no, because it's going to take 1,000 or 3,000 years to melt. They had said that this 10% of the world's ice that covers West Antarctica, if it were to go, would cause 20 feet of sea level rise. So I realized that what happened 120,000 years ago, something had to cause 10% of the world's ice to melt very, very quickly. And that's when I started to look at Antarctica, and then later on Greenland. And when you realize that 90% of the world's ice is over Antarctica, and 80% of that is over East Antarctica, which is mostly in a bowl of mountains, it seems very unlikely that East Antarctica melted, or very much of it melted, 120,000 years ago. And at that time, in the late 1990s, I didn't know much about Greenland, so I didn't speculate. But Greenland has about as much ice as West Antarctica. And nowadays, the scientists think that most of West Antarctica, as well as a good chunk of Greenland, melted 120,000 years ago. Turns out that, I was just an activist. I am trained as a scientist. I went to UC San Diego and trained with a lot of Scripps Institution of Oceanography professors. But still, I was just one guy. I'm not a peer-reviewed scientist. And I published a paper in 1998 in the Earth Island Journal sounding this warning that I thought that the madhouse century could happen again, that global warming, if it caused the West Antarctic ice sheet to break up, it could trigger a new ice age. So I was hoping that over the years, as I looked at the peer-reviewed science, that I'd be shown to be wrong. Because if the West Antarctic ice sheet breaks up and we have 20 feet of sea level rise, it's almost over for civilization. 80% of the biggest, 80 of the 100 biggest cities in the world live in the coastal areas that would be swamped by 20 feet of sea level rise. 80 of the 100 biggest cities. 10% of the human population lives in areas that will be covered by 10 feet of sea level rise. So the years went by. Nobody else seemed to put it together. The glaciologists didn't talk with the sea level people until 2009. And then some scientists published an article in Nature magazine saying that they had seen the same thing I saw 120,000 years ago, happened 1 million years ago. And they pointed to West Antarctica and Greenland as the cause. So we have two situations where the West Antarctic ice sheet broke up, caused 20 feet of sea level rise, and in both cases it happened rapidly, which is really critically important because people should no longer think about West Antarctica taking 1,000 to 3,000 years to break up. You'll see that in 2014, scientists down in Antarctica with NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and UC Irvine, they sounded an ominous warning. They said that the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet is now unstoppable. That's their word, not mine. That means the 20 feet of sea level rise is now unstoppable. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And the reason is, if you picture, if you've ever been in a waterbed, and you sit in the middle of your waterbed, the vinyl or whatever it is, it pushes down in the middle. And the weight of West Antarctica pushes the land down too. So West Antarctica is sitting in a bowl under the ocean. And what's happened is the points that were holding it in place, the ice is melted back. And as we saw in that NASA video, just 6 glaciers on the Amundsen Sea, if they melt, that's going to cause 4 feet of sea level rise. And so when they go, then the rest of West Antarctica's ice sheet is going to start to go. And the problem is, it's pretty stable at the moment. So when this announcement was made in 2014, they just talked about that 4 feet of sea level rise from those 6 glaciers. But if you study the history of the ice sheet going back millions of years, you know that. But once that's gone, the rest of it is going to go. So they were talking in terms of 100 or 200 years. Then a year later, you'll see that in 2015, James Hansen's team, working with the same NASA and JPL and UC Irvine scientists, as well as many, many more around the world, they have now predicted that we're going to see 10 feet of sea level rise over the next 50 years. 10 feet over the next 50 years. And then a year later, there was a conference of 10,000 insurance industry risk assessment specialists, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration did a presentation there. And you may have heard Jill Stein talk about this, but they're predicting 9 feet of sea level rise by 2050. 9 feet over the next 33 years. And then this year, the state of California has issued a report, and theirs is a warning that there's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise over the next 70 years. So things have changed very, very rapidly, yet nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about it in politics especially.
We are heading towards a particular sector of West Antarctica draining into the Amundsen Sea. This sector is drained by 6 glaciers. The biggest ones are Pine Island Glacier and Thwaites Glacier. The speed of the glaciers measured by satellite is shown in color code. Red is fast, blue is slower, and green is the slowest. The glaciers flow into the sea and form floating extensions called ice shelves. Now in red are the areas where the flow speed is increasing almost every year. The darker the red, the more the glacier has been speeding up. You see that all the glaciers are speeding up. Now we focus our attention on the Smith Glacier, which is a smaller glacier, but which has experienced some of the most dramatic changes. The grounding line of Smith Glacier in 1996 is at the transition boundary between the blue color, the ice shelf, and the white color, ice resting on the continent. Now we transition to 2011. The grounding line is 35 kilometers farther back, a retreat of nearly 2 kilometers per year. If we could peel off the ice from the continent and see the bed, this is what it would look like. The arrows indicate the flow direction of ice. Their color indicates the speed. Blue is slow, red is fast. We see that the glaciers flow on top of major subglacial valleys colored in brown. The darker the brown color, the deeper the valleys. As the glaciers retreat, they will follow these deep valleys. There is no mountain or big hill along the way that could act as a barrier to hold these glaciers back. The glaciers speed up, the grounding line retreat, the deep valleys that are sloping inland all reinforce each other to make the retreat of ice in this part of Antarctica unstoppable. And we think that this is what is happening right now.
A controversial paper released this week claims to bring new understanding to just how much damage we've done and says it may be worse than previously believed, predicting much faster polar melting and thus potentially catastrophic sea level rises, much faster than we ever believed possible, as much as 10 feet within just 50 years. The paper's lead author is a name you may know. The Washington Post calls him the world's most famous climate scientist. James Hansen is the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He is the man whom many credit with bringing global warming to the world's attention in the 1980s through some striking congressional testimony. He's now an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Earth Institute. You say that there will be a 10 feet rise in 50 years. What does that mean? It feels like a long way off. This number is, what would that mean?
Not only would it be 10 feet, but it would imply that in the next decades after that, it would be even more. Because where this water is coming from is the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, and then there's another part of the East Antarctic Ice Sheet, which also has several meters of sea level rise in its ice. So what that would mean is coastal cities would become dysfunctional. Parts of the city would still be above water, but it wouldn't make sense to try to rebuild them partially because they know the water is going to keep rising. So we can't let it go unstable. we would lose all the coastal cities in the world, and that's enormous costs, which would affect everybody, whether they're living on the coast or not.
And most of the world lives around coastlines.
That's right.
But your hypothesis, you look back, you look at a period that's really 120,000 years ago, and some of your critics are saying, well, who knows if that's applicable now? Why did you choose that?
Well, we did several things. That was one of the things we did, is to look at the last time it was warmer than today. And it was less than 1 degree Celsius warmer than today, and sea level reached heights of 6 to 8 meters higher than today. So if we allow the temperature to go 2 degrees higher, we're guaranteeing that that sea level rise will occur. We just aren't sure how fast it will occur. And what our study shows, it's a lot faster than the glaciologists had imagined. There were a lot of people becoming very suspicious that the IPCC was underestimating the sea level problem. What the science is telling us is that we have an emergency. If we want our children and grandchildren to inherit a planet which is not running out of their control, we're going to have to reduce emissions as fast as practical.
Thwaites Glacier is located in a really remote part of Antarctica. Antarctica is already difficult to get to, already a difficult place to put people in the field doing science. But this particular area is sort of at the limit of both the US resources from one side and the British resources from another. It's going to take both nations' capabilities in Antarctica in order to set all of these studies out on the ice.
I've worked in Antarctica now for almost 30 years, and I've worked in West Antarctica for much of that time. This is the first opportunity that we've had to visit Thwaites Glacier and mount the scale of scientific program that will actually give us the answers that we need to reducing that uncertainty around sea level rise.
In Climate Watch, Wired's January cover story is taking readers far into the mostly unknown, all the way to Antarctica's Thwaites Glacier. The story, The Race to Understand Antarctica's Most Terrifying Glacier, looks at the science being used to understand the giant glacier and hopefully slow its collapse.
The Thwaites Glacier is comparable to the size of Florida, and scientists say that it's having an impact on rising sea levels and has impacts that can even change the course of civilization. So John Gertner is the author of that story in Wired.
It's very hard to get to, actually. Only about 24 people have ever been there in all of history. And there are three things I think worth knowing about Thwaites. One, it's really large. It's the size of Florida or the size of Great Britain. So it contains an immense amount of ice. And the second thing is that it's unstable. Warm ocean waters are eroding the bottom of it so that it's starting to pull back and retreat and collapse into the ocean. The third thing is that it's interconnected with all these other glaciers in the same area of the sea, and if Thwaites goes, then all of those can go as well. So we're talking anywhere of several feet of sea level rise to a worst case scenario of something like 10 feet of sea level rise.
So in your report, Wired says the demise of this glacier could rise by more than 12 feet, and this is a quote: "When that happens, goodbye Miami, goodbye Boston." It's really stark.
It's stark, it's terrifying. Sridhar Anandakrishnan, who's the main scientist in my story, talks about it as the world's most terrifying glacier. And the scientists that are studying this and that are going to spend the next 5 years working on trying to understand it better are trying to figure out how fast can this thing move into the ocean. There's a $50 million scientific effort. It's a coalition between the United States scientists and Great Britain. They're doing all sorts of different tests. Some of these scientists are looking at the water in front of the edge of Thwaites to see how it's warming. The group that I focused on are using literally bombs, explosives, that they're burying into the ice about 50 or 100 feet. They track the seismic waves. So what happens is they dig a big hole, they put a small explosive in, they cover it up with snow, they explode it, and they track the waves as they go to the bottom of the ice sheet and then back to the surface. And by doing this, they can kind of understand what's under the glacier. And if they can understand that, they might be able to tell us how fast it's going to slide back. We don't know how much time we have. One hope is that the next 5 years, the Thwaites collaboration will give us some answers. They can put in some data into these models to help us understand how fast this can really happen. The two things we can do are, one, stop putting so much CO2 in the atmosphere. That's the big one. But there are some other sort of riskier moonshot ideas that maybe we can do some kind of engineering fixes. These are really speculative at the moment, but maybe we can build something to protect this glacier from warm water. But at the moment, the best thing we can do is to try and do better in terms of moving our economy to putting less greenhouse gases into the air.
We have two pieces of fossil coral that was recovered from drill cores off of Barbados. So by dating these samples and knowing the depth at which they were retrieved, we can use that information to create a point-by-point reconstruction of sea level for the last 20,000 years. There's one particular sea level rise of interest. We call it Meltwater Pulse 1A. During that period of time, we believe sea level rose about 20 meters in 500 years, or about 4 to 5 meters per 100 years.
If the same happens again, it would translate to as much as 16 feet of additional sea level rise in the next century. Factor in today's affairs, and the rise may be even faster. If the oceans rose with accelerating speed, the planet's most exposed cities may not have time to build adequate sea defenses. Sea levels would rise by 16 feet per century. New Orleans could flood, followed by Miami.
Miami's the worst off, and New Orleans, those are two cities that will have to be abandoned, I imagine.
As southern Florida is lost to the sea, other coastal regions will also struggle to hold back the tides. Among them is the San Francisco Bay Area, with its 7.5 million people.
The San Francisco Bay Area is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise because of our history. Although the bay is big, it's very shallow. 2/3 of it was less than 12 feet deep. So lots of it was filled and reclaimed. We're standing here on reclaimed land, and all of downtown San Francisco, the financial district, is on reclaimed land. We've already seen 7 inches of sea level rise in the bay over the past century. We know this because the longest continuously operating tide gauge in America is at the Golden Gate. So we have 154 years of data. We're just now beginning to realize with accelerated sea level rise, we're going to have to prepare and have a new plan for how we deal with it in the Bay Area.
If sea levels rose by an additional 16 feet per century, hundreds of thousands of people would lose their homes in the Bay Area. To protect San Francisco Bay, levees would have to be built on a massive scale.
The silver lining is the engineering will create so many jobs. Holding off the sea would be the major employer of the world by 2100, I think. This is going to be worldwide. We're going to have a dam revolution.
The bay's entire coastline would have to be defended with levees in order to protect it. But in the east, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta would remain vulnerable because it's at or below sea level. The Delta has some of America's most fertile farmland.
The most important part is food. It's unbelievable the proportion of human food that comes from land that is at sea level, not necessarily right next to the sea, but at an elevation that will be impacted by sea level rising. Sea level rises a little, all those fields next to it, even if they're not covered by the sea, are rendered useless for human crops by the sea.
If the Delta and its farmland were lost to the sea, California's food supply would be in jeopardy. The Delta is also one of the main sources of fresh water on the American West Coast.
This is the hub of California's water supply. 26 million people drink water that comes from this estuary. That's a huge number. 2/3 of the population of California gets water from this estuary. If you raise sea level even a foot, which in our mind isn't all, as geologists, that doesn't seem like much, yeah, but that's common, yeah. If you raise sea level a foot, the work that we've done suggests that you will salt up this end of the delta, even if the levees all stay together, even if they don't fail.
If sea levels rise by 6 feet this century, local rivers will be contaminated with salt, and California's main fresh water supply will be lost. In the next century, after an additional 16 feet, the entire delta will be claimed by the sea. But there may be a way to defend both the Delta and San Francisco Bay.
San Francisco is among the best, easiest to save. The most radical solution would be putting a big dam right across the bay under the Golden Gate Bridge.
On the ocean side, the sea is about 130 feet deep. Building a dam would be controversial and would turn the bay into a freshwater lagoon. But at a time of intense sea level rise, some may consider this the best option. Using cutting-edge technology, huge dredgers could pick up sand from the seabed nearby and deposit it as the dam's foundation. The dam's shallow incline would ensure maximum stability against earthquakes, breaking the power of the ocean waves with ease. Vast pipes and pumps would be installed to keep the bay's river water flowing out to sea. The Golden Gate Dam would cost $2.5 billion and could be heightened to deal with any sea level rise in the future. San Francisco and the Bay Area would be saved. One region that may benefit from the U.S.'s sea defenses is the Mediterranean. It's flanked by countries both rich and poor that have thousands of years of history. The Mediterranean has a unique feature, a narrowing at its mouth. The Straits of Gibraltar are between 10 and 20 miles wide, stretching from southern Spain to Africa. A dam could keep the rising water of the Atlantic separate from the Mediterranean.
There's been a plan since World War II, for instance, to put a dam between the Rock of Gibraltar and Morocco on the African side. A dam big enough that sea level rise does not affect the Mediterranean.
But building a dam here has one major drawback. Every year, the Mediterranean loses 2 feet of sea level through evaporation that is compensated by the inflow of water from the Atlantic. The dam would cut this off.
In the case that you build a dam in the Gibraltar Straits, there will not be the flow of water from the Atlantic. So in the case that you cut the flow, so there will be a evaporation, there will not be compensation, and there will be a permanent drop of the water level.
After years of evaporation, the Mediterranean would turn into a stagnant saltwater lake. Eventually, the sea would dry out.
And if then the sea level would rise, let's say another...
Sea defense engineer Peter Janssen maps out possible solutions on how to keep the Atlantic flowing while building the world's largest super dam.
I looked at the surroundings. I looked at what may be required to make a closure. And then, well, I thought it may be feasible.
One of Janssen's solutions is to use the same building techniques applied to the Golden Gates. The dam would be 20 miles long and tower 1,250 feet above the seabed, the same height as the Empire State Building. Another solution is to keep the natural flow of the Gibraltar Straits. Huge amounts of Atlantic surface water will flow into the Mediterranean. At a much lower depth, some of the Med's saltier water will be pumped back out again, keeping the sea's salt and sea level stable. The world's greatest super dam would cost $275 billion.
The total cost related to what may be the impact for all the cities around the Mediterranean, it seems acceptable. It may be a solution.
The Gibraltar Dam would be the world's largest man-made structure, using enough rock to build 1,000 Great Pyramids. Although the dam would cut off the migration of marine life between the Med and the Atlantic, it would save the entire Mediterranean coastline from flooding.
It's certainly technologically possible. The old cradle of civilization becomes really the center of civilization. They would be the last coastal cities never affected by sea level rising.